welcome up Professor Shawn Watts. He comes to KU Law from Columbia Law School in New York City, where he was the Associate Director of the Mediation Program. He taught an advanced mediation clinic and a Native American peacemaking clinic. He has been a visiting professor at both Yale Law School and National Taiwan University Law School in Taipei, Taiwan. In his practice, Watts mediates federal and state cases with an emphasis in employment discrimination. He is also a lead trainer for the United Nations Institute of Training and Research, where he trains and advises world diplomats in conflict resolution, negotiation, and peace dialogue. Please help me in welcoming Professor Watts.
All right. So, I've been a teacher for a long time, longer than I've just been teaching in law schools. Before I went to law school, I was a high school teacher for 10 years. A high school math teacher was like the hardest possible subject to teach in high school. So what I know from teaching is that you cannot keep students past the bell, so I'm going to get you out of here. Another thing that I know is that, as you just heard, I've been in New York for the last 18 years, so I can talk fast. I can make this work. Okay? So yeah, okay, thank you. Okay. So we're going to talk, oh, come on now. There we go. Okay, so we're going to be talking about the ACEs study, and I will describe to you what that is and how it works and so forth, what's in it. I'm going to talk about a little bit of the brief background on techniques of traditional justice, or tribal traditional justice techniques, get a closer look at the process, and then talk about why that's a more advantageous system than our normal system for child welfare. What we're about to talk about is not going to be fun stuff. I tell you that because I have never developed an adequate coping mechanism for dealing with difficult things. My main way of getting through things is humor. So you may hear some jokes that you think are way inappropriate. I apologize. I will tell you this, almost everyone that I know as acquaintances instead of close in my life thinks my wife and I are divorced because she refuses to sit anywhere near me at funerals. So just understand what made me come. Okay, so what are ACEs? That stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences. It's a study that was put on quite by accident, or at least it started by accident, at an obesity clinic in San Diego, California, and then was coalesced with Kaiser Permanente and the CDC, where they studied folks, I think it was around 17,000 people, around these adverse childhood experiences. We're going to talk about what those are, and then looked towards long-term health outcomes. So the reason this was important is because when people go through adverse childhood experiences, there are long-term, lifelong, set-in trauma or outcomes that set in. So those happen on the emotional level, they happen on the physical level, the mental level, and most importantly, and I think interestingly, the physiological level. So your body changes, your chemistry changes from going through these experiences, related to your own individual trauma and then intergenerational trauma as well. We're going to talk about that. So some of the ACEs factors are emotional abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional neglect, physical neglect. Was your mother treated violently? So was your main female role model somebody who was going through some of these violent experiences herself? Were there members of your household who were addicted to alcohol or drugs? Or is there someone in your household who was mentally ill? Are you a child of separation or divorce, or even in some cases a single parent home? Is there somebody who's in your immediate household who is incarcerated? So all these, again, we're not talking about pleasant experiences here. There are jokes coming, just prepare, I apologize. Okay. So, taking a look at these, when they submitted this to their 17,000 participants in the study, they found emotional abuse came in at 11%. I thought that was kind of remarkably low for what I would have been expecting. Physical abuse much higher, 28%, sexual abuse at 21%, emotional neglect at 15%, physical neglect at 10%, was the mother treated violently, 13%, household member of drugs or alcohol, 27%. Member mentally ill, 19%, separated or divorced, 23%, and household member incarcerated, 5%. Okay. The reason that matters is this. This ACEs pyramid sort of tracks the sort of building of what ends up with, come on, do it. Oh, it's not doing it. There we go. Oh, it's not doing it. doing that up there? It's doing it on my computer. Oh, it makes me sad. I love this thing. Okay, it ends up in early death, right? So you start out with all of these adverse childhood experiences, and those lead to set-in social, emotional, and cognitive impairments. And then what you do is you adopt risk behaviors to try to cope with those impairments. You end up with disease, different disabilities, and social problems, and all those culminate in the top of the pyramid at early death. So as you're looking at those, as you're looking at ACEs as a sort of study, the number of people in the study who experienced 0 of these ACEs factors, 0 was 33%. Who experienced 1 was 26%, 2, 16, 3, 10. And these reds, 4, 5, and 6, are there for a reason. These show us, and we're going to look at the results in a second, that these results start to become cumulative. So it's not like something just happens and then eventually you deal with it and it's gone. They accumulate. And here's what happens. If you have 4 or more, or 4 ACEs experience as compared to somebody who has none, you're twice as likely to smoke. You're 7 times more likely to be an alcoholic. You're 10 times more likely to inject drugs. You're 12 times more likely to attempt suicide. And so you put that all together, and that starts to make sense, right? If you juxtapose the cumulative effects with the ACEs pyramid, you can start to see, as they put it together, you can see how that might work. Okay, here's the thing about going back to here, these adoption of high-risk behaviors. Here's the thing about those. Most of those are perfectly adapted behaviors for what the person is experiencing. And by that, what we mean is this. So if you have an ACEs score of 7 or more, you are 51 times more likely to attempt suicide as an adolescent. And it doesn't end there. If you somehow make it through that 51 times more likely, you still, as an adult, are 30 times more likely. And so many of these behaviors are adapted, that the people take on are adapted to alleviate what they're feeling from the different trauma that they felt. So think of it as, I always hesitate to tell this story because it seems so trivial when I tell it, but I'll tell it anyway. One time, I accidentally did not, this is before I understood how to cook, I undercooked red beans, and I don't know if you guys know this, if so, if not, it's a PSA. Undercooked red beans are toxic. Red beans are toxic if not cooked properly. And it is a high potent toxin too. Did anyone not know that? Great. Cook your red beans. Really cook the crap out of them, and you gotta do that. But I didn't know that, and so I undercooked these red beans. And I threw up for 8 solid hours. I was maybe 24, something like that, 25. It was the very first time in my life that I understood suicide. And by that, here's what I meant. And I don't mean this in any joking way at all. In that moment, I would have done anything for the pain to stop. I had the luxury of knowing that I was eventually going to throw up all of my guts and there would be nothing else. It was going to stop at some point. I had the luxury of knowing that. But in that moment, I would have done anything to make it stop. And so if you are a person who's not just food poisoned, if you're a person whose pain is deep set in your soul, it's deep set, we talked about the physiology, it's deep set in your muscles, in your bones, it's in your chemistry, suicide is an absolutely reasonable and rational adaptive behavior to deal with what you have going on. In this, as the ACEs study started out, it was at an obesity clinic, and one of the things that the doctor knows, Dr. Folletti, knows is that something that he figured out about obesity is that overeating was an adaptive behavior. Becoming obese was an adaptive behavior because it could deal with your physical trauma, it could deal with your emotional trauma and your mental trauma. And the reason, because if you became someone that other people didn't just want to ignore, didn't want to look at, or you felt like they were repulsed by, then they weren't going to touch you anymore. They weren't going to address you or acknowledge you anymore. Any of those things. And so that is, again, a perfectly adaptive behavior to dealing with your trauma, as are lots of the other things that people do that we think are as irresponsible behavior. So drug abuse, alcohol, all those sorts of things. So we think these are perfectly adaptable, I mean, we know these are perfectly adapted behaviors, so how do we deal with them? Well, often the treatment comes in the form of something that's punitive, or it comes in the form of something that is like in a rehab setting but really unsupportive. Often we ask these people to fix these behaviors cold turkey, or even cold reentry. So we give them a little bit of help, and then we send them back into the arena that was causing the trauma in the first place, or even if that arena is not there anymore, just entry back into the normal workforce where we're trying to get things done, but without any sort of support mechanism, without any sort of training, anything that can help them readapt their behaviors. Okay, so why is this a family court issue? Well, it turns out that these things snowball into adulthood. So if you've got a parent who is an alcoholic, that's an ACE for you. That's an adverse childhood experience for you. And it turns out that it's a predictor that there are other adverse childhood experiences at home. So alcoholism is something that tells you that there might be other adverse childhood experiences happening. Also, an increased ACE score for child increases the likelihood of alcoholism as the child grows. In other words, if you've got a parent who's an alcoholic, that parent we know that that's a sign that there might be other ACEs in the household. So remember, going back before, right? If you've got 4 or more, your increase of smoking and alcohol and suicide attempt goes way up. If you've got 7 or more, I mean, you're off the chart. So if you've got just one parent who's an alcoholic, you're looking at multiple ACE factors. This means you're talking about multiplying all of the things that lead to bad health outcomes. And it increases your chance of becoming an alcoholic as you grow old. So then what happens? I think everyone understands what the next step is. What is the next step? If you become an alcoholic, you have children, alcoholism is a sign that there are other ACE factors present in the household. So those kids that are your own have 4, or 5, or 6, or 7, and then what happens to them? They become an alcoholic, they have children. Right? And we can keep going on this forever. Children of alcoholic parents are 3 times more likely to marry an alcoholic spouse. So what does that mean? Now we've got one parent in the house who's alcoholic and a second parent in the house who's an alcoholic. And remember, just having one parent, just any alcoholism present in the house is a sign that there are going to be multiple other ACE factors. An adult's home is at increased risk of both spouses abusing alcohol and at increased risk of other ACEs in the children. So not a pleasant picture. And I'm really proud of myself for not making so many jokes so far. So maybe it's just because I'm trying to get done. Okay, we're going to shift for a moment because we're going to talk about the Indian Child Welfare Act. I will give you the absolute high points, and then we'll understand in a moment why I'm talking about this. This was an act in 1978 designed to prevent the forced removal of Indian children from their home. You think that doesn't really happen here. That is almost exclusively what happened here. 4 decades. We're talking about child services rolling up in a van, just swooping up all the kids that they can. No warrant, no cause, no anything. Scooping up the kids, taking them out, putting them in boarding schools. In these boarding schools, they are beaten if they speak their own language. They're beaten if they grow their hair long. They are beaten if they dance any of their tribal ceremonies. Any of those things happen, these children are on top of the fact that there's just the other kind of rampant abuse, sexual and otherwise, that goes on in these types of facilities, especially back in a time when these weren't being monitored. If you have any Indian blood, and you have a grandparent who is of some Indian blood, it is almost certain that you know a boarding school kid, and that there may be they may have a much better understanding of what's going on here. So what does the Indian Child Welfare Act do? It gives tribes and members of tribes the ability to intervene in a child placement proceeding if they're going to be placed outside of the home when there's an Indian child. So what is an Indian child? That is a child who is already a member of an Indian tribe or is eligible for membership in an Indian tribe and has a parent who has been a enrolled member of an Indian tribe. So a fairly clear definition. This law is currently being challenged, and I mean, look, white people, I don't mean to denigrate you, but I mean, if this ain't the whitest thing that ever happened. So here's how this challenge goes. Because there are these protections for Indian children, there are lots and lots of big money adoption agencies that make tons and tons of bank trying to just adopt Indian kids off of reservations. I mean lots and lots of money. Just the referral fee, which means you come to me, professor, and say, hey, I want to adopt a kid. I say, hey, go talk to her. I get $25,000 to $50,000 for that. That's not counting the lawyer fees that he's going to pay me eventually as they hook up and decide it's a good idea and we start the proceedings. It doesn't count any of that stuff. So there's really big money. So these big money adoption agencies are challenged this under the theory that it is unconstitutional, that it is a racial preference to provide protections for these Indian children. Now, if you think this through, here's what they're saying. They're not saying, hey, America, this is insane. We have this amazing gold service level of support for these Indian people, and we've got to bring it up for everyone else. That's not what they're saying. They're saying, we've got to bring the Indian kids' support down to the crappy level that everyone else has. And, anybody in here from Texas? Raise your hand. Raise your hand if you're from Texas. Yes, Texas sucks. We all know that. It is a district court in Texas who bought it. Texas. Remind yourself, anytime you see anything in the news about Florida or Arizona or South Carolina, Texas went for this. Okay. So what is traditional justice? Tribal dispute resolution is something that's been done from time immemorial, so we don't know when it started. We have a sense of when America got their hands on it and started screwing it up. The generic term that you might hear for it is peacemaking. If you were here, if you've been here for a whole day, you heard Professor Deere talk about peacemaking a little bit. She and I had to have a conversation afterwards because the gentleman that she's quoting is not somebody who should be writing about these things. The way he's conceptualizing it is so narrow that it makes me angry that it exists. It was lost in the 1880s, and when I say lost, what I mean is this. There was a time period where the U.S. decided that because of how tribes were dealing with things that they considered major, murders and other types of things, through this restorative system, they decided that didn't fit with or comport with our notion as a nation of retributive, punitive justice. If somebody murders someone else, we have to have blood, and that's all we wanted. And so the U.S. passed something called the Major Crimes Act, which keeps tribes from being able to, by statute, resolve their most harmful, their most traumatizing conflicts for themselves. Those go straight to the federal government. Okay, so what are the goals of tribal justice, or traditional justice? The main goal is to restore relationships. So you are trying to bring people back to health with one another, with the final goal being bringing them back to health with the community, and that's what close the circle means. The idea is that we're all one big circle in the tribe, and if somebody is removed from that because there's a conflict, if there's some kink in that, the idea is we've got to put it all back together. So the goal isn't retributive, it's restorative. It's to get everyone back together. The other goal is to reconnect the people to the culture. There's a fundamental belief that if you have a connection to your culture, not just the family that you live in, but the culture around you and the ancestry that comes with that, that you get better results, that you will be a better person by wanting to be, by reconnecting with that culture and being a part of it. So there's an emphasis on your shared history, and you get generational participation. And by that, what I mean is, in court, when you go into court, even in child welfare proceedings, usually mom and dad get to speak. Sometimes if the judge thinks the kid is of age, she might get to speak as well. In a tribal setting, you're talking about including grandma, grandpa, mom and dad, aunts and uncles, going horizontally as well as vertically, and the children. Getting as many people involved as is appropriate, including problem solvers, and we're going to talk about who else is there. The other goal is to respect tradition. So you use tribal processes during the actual ceremony, or during the actual during the peacemaking. You do pipe ceremonies, you do sunrise ceremonies, water ceremonies, fire ceremonies, traditional prayers, any of those things that are helpful to connect people to one another, to remind them how they connect to one another. Even using tribal language, which is something that's been revitalized as tribes are starting to get capital through different business ventures. And retain the values of the tribe as we move forward. So you have these traditional prayers we talked about. There is a talking piece, which is something that is just simply passed from person to person. There are lots of different ways that it could move, but for simplification purposes, passed from person to person, and whoever has the talking piece is able to speak. The other folks are listening. There's a discussion of values, not only of the tribe, but the values of that particular family, and then even the values that you might operate with in any particular peacemaking circle. And a discussion of emphasis a discussion of issues where there's an emphasis on solving problems, for sure, but really talking about transformation, healing, bringing people back to wellness. So who participates? The whole community. And by that I mean you take a really expansive view. So we talked about the generational participation, but then you also include process agents. So you're talking about social workers who are there to support or monitor the children. You're talking about court staff who are involved in what's going on. Different advocates. So many, I think, folks here do CASA. I think some of the people in my mediation clinic do CASA and so forth. And then other kinds of supports. So if you've got counselors, if you've got AA sponsors, language interpreters, even judges get involved in this sometimes. And so school officials, if you're dealing with a juvenile, all kinds of different people who are coming to the table to work together to try to solve a problem. Okay, so why is it better? You end up with much more creative agreements. Here's what we know about court, even in child welfare, is that normally they treat a child as a piece of property. They treat the idea of a right to a child as a strictly legal right, not thinking they do this whole best interest of the child interpretation and whatever, but that's of the child as a piece of property, right? So they're not thinking about the whole child. They're not thinking about the whole family. It usually doesn't extend much past mom and dad, much less to grandma and grandpa. It's holistic and consensus-driven, so you're looking at trying to address the whole problem at once and the whole person at once. The types of agreements you can get in a peacemaking process are great as well, because if you're in a tribal setting, you're talking about the normal written agreements you might get through court, but there are also traditional, customary agreements that tribes may have because of the way their customs and traditions work. So ways to craft agreements which, again, don't have to be enforced through the court, though you can enforce through the court. You have community enforcement as well. And then different monitoring things that can go on. You can schedule regularly checked up additional peacemaking circles or any sort of the other normal processes that you can go through. And so that gives you the opportunity to intervene earlier, right? So if you have something in your child welfare system that allows for people to access the system without getting to that litigation stage, without waiting for there to be a crisis, then you can avert problems, you can help address problems, you can give people the help they need, establish support systems, put resources in place, all these things that you can do, and there's a lot greater information sharing. One of the things in tribal communities that I think makes tribal traditional justice or peacemaking particularly great is it acknowledges the reality of an indigenous community. Most tribes in this country are small. They're small communities. We're talking a few thousand people at the most. Navajo's huge, Cherokee's huge. After that, we're talking about really small communities. And what that means is most of these folks have continuing relationships. They are going to see one another at the grocery store. Their kids are going to play football against one another. Mom and dad are going to have to interact. Right? Those are the kind of things. And then there's a myth of anonymity in tribal communities. The truth is, lots of people in many tribal communities know one another. You know, I get asked all the time, not here, but in New York, at least once a week, somebody would be like, oh, you're the first real Indian I've ever met. And then they would be like, oh, do you know like Ben Six Killer? And I'm like, you know, I do actually, yeah. I mean, it's weird, but yeah, I do know that guy, right? So the truth is like, it is a small community. We try to connect, and so oftentimes people will know there's just not the same kind of anonymity. There's not the kind of distance there. It also gives you just other entry points because tribes have some latitude because of the inherent tribal sovereignty. There are different places you can just enter the system or you can check in on people without having to go through the whole process. So, what I want to say is this. I definitely think it's something that all tribes should be doing, is using this in their child welfare systems to find a way to produce better outcomes, not just for the children, but for the parents. But the thing is this, it's not just tribal communities who can do this. Some of these things are just programmatic, systematic. They're just design things that we could all put together. I would design some of these things for a state court in Kansas or a local court or anything for free. I would just help out. Because when you do this, you end up with much greater outcomes, more positive outcomes, and certainly a greater chance of positive outcomes for everyone involved, not just the kid, not just mom and dad, but all of the people who are around kids who are going through trouble. That means the school, that means their different counselors, brothers and sisters, and everyone else. Okay, questions? I told you I'd get you out of here. It's going to happen. I did talk fast, so I'm sure you have questions. Even if your question is, what? What did you say?
Would you share some of that, maybe one or two examples of where you helped to set this up in different settings and facilitated the sort of adaptation of the traditional justice models you talked about in settings where it was not automatically going to be implemented?
Yeah, so it has happened all over. So two really incredible things have happened. I won't go into the whole history of the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act because it just plays into the whole stereotype that tribes are all super rich because of casinos. But I will say this. What that allowed to happen was tribes to get access to capital that they couldn't get before because of the rules that really restrict how tribal land and tribal resources are used. But once tribes started to get revenue through gaming, they could use that as security for bank loans and so forth. So there was this massive influx of capital in certain communities. And what those communities have then done is do two major things. One is they've started to implement and started to create their own language immersion schools. So you have kids whose grandparents don't speak the language and whose mother and father don't speak the language go into a school in the language of the tribe. Those kids will grow up with that as their first language, which is incredible. The second thing that they've done is started to try to incorporate more tribal justice techniques into their system. If you've never been in a tribal court and you walked into one today, except for maybe seeing some bear skin on the wall or some deer antlers here or there, or different quilts, it's going to look almost exactly like any other court that you walk into. And what that means is our justice system, because it was forced on the tribes, to be clear, it was forced onto the tribes. But it's basically what you would expect. You could get the same justice at the local district court here, you get the same justice at the local federal court. But now these tribes have started to implement these processes, and so I've worked with tribes in Wisconsin, in Michigan, in New Mexico, Oklahoma, North Carolina, really all over. And they do lots of different things. So child welfare is one of them. Another kind of, and juveniles is an easy place to start because of the way tribal council and bylaws and so are set up. It's really, really hard to get this peacemaking stuff going en masse. But it's really, really easy to get people to buy into the idea that we ought to be doing something to provide our children better outcomes. And so that's something that I think has been happening. I've done it in a bunch of different places. It happens in kind of different capacities. One of the things, I would say the first thing I always tell a tribe that I'm working with, because they say, what should we be doing? And my first answer is always, you tell me what you should be doing. Meaning, your tribe it has its own customs, it has its own traditions, it has its own structure. You tell me what's important to you. I can certainly help you with the design part, the programmatic piece. But the piece that's going to be useful, the piece that's going to connect with your people is the piece that comes from you guys. And so that's really the most important aspect of it, is using what the ancestry, using the history, using the culture as the backbone, and then you just lay these design pieces over the top of it. And that might look different in different places depending on one of the things that we always have to be on the lookout for when we're dealing with child welfare are the different mandatory reporting statutes that the tribe may have, and even sometimes depending on the jurisdictional boundaries that the state may have, that the tribe may have to adhere to. So lots of different kind of stuff. I know that's not a great answer. And the reason there's not a great answer to that is there are 573 tribes. And though regionally some of them might look the same, like the Oklahoma tribes might look very similar, the Pueblo tribes in New Mexico might look very similar, the Rancheria tribes in California might look similar, the Northwest tribes might look similar, we're very different. And so what happens is when I'm working with anyone, that's sort of my first piece, is to just step back and say, you tell me who you are. The expertise I have is just the programmatic stuff. That's easy, that's design stuff. You guys can learn that in a couple weeks. I just don't tell. It's the cultural piece that matters. Other questions? Yes.
Yeah, we're with the Spray Down Potawatomi Peacemaker Circle, from Down Potawatomi.
Yes, I know Chris.
Yeah, well, he was supposed to come, but he said he didn't get the register in time, but we did. He
Good.
registered. But we were wondering, is there any way he can come up to our reservation and talk to our people? Because we just love to have more people come up and give us some more comments.
I can, and in fact, I met with the prosecutor and one of your main judges in December. Unfortunately, it was right before the Christmas break. My family's still back in New Jersey, so I skipped town as soon as the Christmas break came. So yes, happy to, and in fact, it's something I think we should get going. I think Julia was the prosecutor that I spoke with, and I can't remember the judge's name.
Eileen Barr.
Okay, yes, so I spoke to Judge Barr as well. So it's something that I know is of interest, and it's really a matter of us kind of getting together and making it work. So I'm here and happy to help as much as I can, and so it's really just, I'll give you a card when I'm done, and we'll just make sure there are enough of us putting pressure on the other folks that they can't delay for too much longer.
I know there's enough tribes doing peacemaking circles. I know the other 7 bands of our Potawatomi tribe around the U.S., we were pushing it and going on, but there are a lot of tribes that don't have peacemaking.
That's right. So one of the main tribes that I work with is the Hokkaido band, Potawatomi in Michigan.
That's our peacemaking
Yeah.
band.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, we have that Hannahville and Forest County and what other place up in Canada? We've got 7 bands.
Yeah. And so one of the things I know about the Potawatomi is you've got those 7 grandfathers to work with. So you've got a really well-defined cultural base to use as a base of value system to start to springboard this. So you're actually in a great place. Happy to help.
Yeah, we've been doing a lot with divorce, child support, and visitation. We do basically anything if anybody wants us to talk.
Awesome.
And luckily our judge is going along with it, because a lot of times she'll say, well, this could be done at home, with us coming over and talking to you guys, and helping you guys come to a conclusion of what each wants, and say that you'll get what you want. It's a good thing.
Awesome.